I just noticed an important looking document on your desk and called in a rush. You need it today, don't you? The person on the other end was Stephen, the manager who always seemed to target Emily. Yes, but we just talked about handling documents more carefully, didn't we? Well, it's probably too late now anyway. His tone sounded as if he'd waited to call until he was sure it was too late for the meeting. Though it was only his voice over the phone, I could easily imagine his smug smile. That's. Emily looked at me, hesitating with her words. What am I supposed to do now? Interpreting complex matters like this on the spot, only someone fluent in English could pull it off. Fluent in English? Suddenly, Mr. Nash's face lit up, as though he'd just had an idea. Mr. Nash? Emily tilted her head slightly, looking at him with curiosity. Emily, we have someone here who's fluent in English. I meet the gaze of Mr. Nash. He looks directly at me and says, Sean, I need your help. My name is Sean. In my 40s now, my waistline has become a bit more noticeable, something that never used to bother me. My current job is as a driver for the president of a household goods company. Every morning, I drive to the president's home, then take him to the office or to his business appointments. In the fast-paced world of household goods, keeping up with consumer needs is no easy feat. The company I drive for, Taro Corporation, has gained some attention on social media recently. Though not a major player, it's well known in its field, and with social media's rise, its performance has grown steadily. Mr. Nash, the president I drive for, is about my age but keeps fit, is tall, and carries himself with style. He has an easygoing charm and is hard to forget once you meet him. I, on the other hand, am often told, you look familiar, even though it's usually by people I've never met. In other words, I have one of those faces that blends in anywhere. One day, when I picked up Mr. Nash for his usual workday, he handed me a small wrapped package. Mr. Nash? What's this? Take it. A client gave it to me, but I don't need more of these. I unwrapped it and found a small golden cat figurine. It might look cute on a desk, but as a man in my 40s, I wasn't sure what to do with it. Unfortunately, as a driver, I don't even have my own desk at work. Thank you. Noticing my hesitant reaction, Mr. Nash raised an eyebrow and said, Try looking a bit more appreciative. By the way, it's supposedly made of pure gold. What? I was startled and almost dropped a cat figurine, but my reaction seemed to amuse Mr. Nash, who chuckled as he got into the car. After carefully putting the cat figurine in my pocket, I closed the back door. Like most companies, President has a secretary responsible for managing the president's schedule and other tasks. Mr. Nash is no exception, and the person who rides with him most frequently in the company car I drive is his secretary, Emily. Emily is a talented, beautiful young woman who was selected as Mr. Nash's secretary early in her career. With a strong sense of responsibility, she anticipates tasks well in advance, although she's quite reserved and not much of a talker. Because of her quiet nature, she isn't the type to confront others, even when she overhears whispers about herself from colleagues. I haven't personally heard any comments, but rumor has it that Emily is disliked by her supervisor in the secretary department, Stephen. When Mr. Nash's former secretary retired, he personally chose Emily to take on the role. At the time, Stephen, who was an experienced senior secretary, probably didn't appreciate this decision, as Emily was a rookie with only about a year of experience at the company. I can understand Stephen's reasoning that someone with more experience should have the job, but he's still complaining, even though it was Mr. Nash's own decision. At that time, Stephen was still an assistant manager, but he was later promoted to manager and took on the responsibility of overseeing the department. However, he seems to have a naturally persistent personality. He still appears to treat Emily rather harshly. Even though Emily is Mr. Nash's secretary, she doesn't stick to him constantly. She spends much of her time at her desk handling office work. Working in an uncomfortable environment within her own department must be a big source of stress for her. Stephen often speaks to Emily in a harsh tone. Emily, being cautious, rarely makes big mistakes, but everyone slips up sometimes. Other colleagues would typically get off with a simple "be careful next time," but only Emily is always criticized by Stephen excessively. Colleagues are too afraid to stand up for her, fearing that defending her might put them in Stephen's bad books. They'll chat with her when he's not around, but it seems no one is willing to shield her from him. That day, on the way to a client, Mr. Nash asked me to make a quick stop, so I pulled over. "Wait here a minute," he instructed, leaving me and Emily waiting in the car. Emily, usually so calm, looked somewhat down that day and sighed quietly. "Are you okay? You seem a bit tired." "Huh? Oh, is it that obvious?" When I spoke to her, Emily responded in a flustered manner. "Oh. No, I didn't mean you looked tired, more like, I just sensed it." I realized too late that mentioning her appearance might be rude and tried to cover it up. Do I really look that bad? Stephen had a lot to say to me earlier. Of course, Stephen was the reason. Did he give you a hard time again? Sometimes, like today, Mr. Nash leaves Emily and me in the car while he goes off to handle his own errands. During those times, I usually chat with Emily while we wait, and naturally, the conversation often turns to matters related to the secretary department. Emily's sighs are nearly always caused by Stephen. This morning, I was looking over the minutes from our meeting when Mr. Nash called me, so I left my seat. I just put the notes in my desk drawer. Emily, the president's secretary, always prioritizes the president above all in her work. She constantly puts her own administrative tasks on hold, which I think must be a tough job. Minutes are confidential, but I plan to file them in the cabinet as soon as I got back. She explained that Mr. Nash always keeps meetings brief, so even when called, she's not gone long. But even those brief moments don't escape Stephen's notice. When you got back, Stephen was waiting for you. Yeah, it was barely a couple of minutes, but Stephen told me it doesn't matter if it's 1 minute or 2. I shouldn't have left those confidential documents outside the cabinet. I could almost picture Stephen's smug face. It's like he's on a mission to spot even the smallest of her mistakes. But they were in your drawer, right? Leaving them out might be bad, but for a couple of minutes, and with no one around. We rarely have outside visitors to our department, but even so, it wasn't the right thing to do. I know it was my fault, but when he keeps pushing, it really makes me down. It seems Stephen has made it his mission to never miss an opportunity to find fault with Emily. He's practically satisfied to make her feel small over the tiniest things. Maybe you should talk to Mr. Nash about it sometime? I doubt anyone in the department would dare call Stephen out on his attitude. I started to worry that if this situation continued, Emily might eventually reach her breaking point. No. I can't just bring something like this up to Mr. Nash. I just need to step up and work flawlessly so even Stephen can't find any faults. From what I could see, Emily handled her work exceptionally well, and I'd never seen Mr. Nash criticize her about anything. On the contrary, he was often quite proud when a client would compliment his assistant. Really? Well, if things do get out of hand, leaning on others could be an option. Better to avoid anything irreversible. You're right, but I'd still like to try a bit longer on my own. She gave me a smile as she said it. I wondered if I'd somehow pressured her into saying that, but honestly, all I could do at that moment was listen. Got it. Just don't overdo it, okay? Thank you. Just then, Mr. Nash returned to the car, having finished his errands. Oh, Emily, do you have today's contract with Goodness? Goodness was the industry's largest lifestyle goods manufacturer and clearly a market leader. They were about to launch a major project with Taro Corporation. Today was the day we'd head to Goodness headquarters for the contract signing. Yes, of course. I've never handled a $10 million deal before. It's definitely nerve-wracking. But as she rummaged through her bag, I saw her expression turn pale. Well, I have the English files. Emily? Excuse me. Please give me a moment. Her tense tone changed the atmosphere in the car in an instant. She frantically overturned her bag, but it seemed that what she was looking for wasn't there. No way, I was sure I'd put it in here. Staring blankly into her bag, Emily's voice sounded dazed. Apparently, the critical documents for the $10 million deal were nowhere to be found. Even Mr. Nash looked momentarily speechless in shock. But at the same time, I wondered, would someone as meticulous as Emily really make such a mistake? I'd watched Emily and Mr. Nash head off to meetings like this several times, and nothing like this had ever happened before. Emily, being as responsible as she was, always said she'd double-check her bag to avoid any slip-ups. Yet, I reminded myself that Emily was only human, so mistakes are possible. As I thought back to our earlier conversation, Stephen's face came to mind, but even if he disliked her, could he really sabotage such a crucial company project? When's the meeting scheduled? I turned to ask, and she replied, looking paler than ever. It's at 1 p.m., but we're not going to make it back in time. The clock showed 12:30. There was no way we'd make it back to the office in time. Emily looked at Mr. Nash with tears in her eyes. Mr. Nash, I lost the critical file. Oh boy. English isn't my strong suit at all. Mr. Nash held his head in his hands as Emily lowered her gaze, still pale. I do have the Japanese documents, but they said the overseas division would be there today. Apparently, this project with Goodness was an international collaboration. Emily mentioned $10 million earlier, which would make this Taro Corporation's first international deal. Naturally, we didn't want to risk such a significant project failing. Yeah. I just don't think I can explain all this contract information fluently in English. Mr. Nash glanced at the Japanese version of the contract. Interpreting all this complex information on the spot, only someone fluent in English could pull it off. Fluent in English? Wait, hold on. Suddenly, Mr. Nash looked as if he had an idea and lifted his head. Mr. Nash? Emily glanced at him, tilting her head in confusion. Emily. We have someone fluent in English right here. I meet Mr. Nash's gaze. He looks directly at me and speaks. Sean, I need you to do this. What? Wait, what are you talking about? In my shock, I momentarily forgot that I was Mr. Nash's driver. Come on. You can handle this, right? Mr. Nash clasped his hands in front of him, practically bowing as if asking to borrow some class notes. You can't just spring this on me. Why me, anyway? I shook my head in disbelief, but Mr. Nash leaned toward me in the driver's seat, practically pleading. This is the company's future on the line. It's a $10 million deal. His eyes were serious. But I couldn't just agree that easily. After all, I was just the driver now. Don't put a $10 million deal on the shoulders of the driver. You know I've been out of practice. Mr. Nash was right. I used to be good at English. But that was back in my student days, and I hadn't used it since starting this job. I know, but you can do it. You were part of all those debates in supervision, right? Supervision, that was ages ago. Hearing that word brought back old memories, and I felt myself starting to drift back to my college days. I couldn't fall for it, this was exactly what Mr. Nash wanted. Wait a minute, what's going on here? Emily, who had been left out of the loop, looked between us, wide-eyed. Just then, her phone rang. Oh, it's the office. Excuse me, I need to take this. While Emily took the call, Mr. Nash and I continued our whispered back and forth, me saying no way, and him pleading, please. Wait, hold on. Suddenly, Emily raised her voice, and both Mr. Nash and I turned to look at her. Noticing something unusual, Mr. Nash whispered to Emily, put it on speaker. While continuing the conversation, Emily switched the phone to speaker mode. I'm sure I put it in my bag. I even double-checked. I didn't leave it on my desk. Oh, well, I just happened to notice some important looking papers on your desk and thought I'd give you a call. You sure you won't be needing them today? The voice on the line was indeed Stephen's. Yes, but we just talked about handling important documents, didn't we? Although, I'm sure it's all too late by now. It was as if he had waited until he was sure we wouldn't make it in time to call. Even over the phone, I could practically see the smug look on his face. That's. Emily glanced at me, her words faltering. What was I supposed to do here? What do you intend to do about this colossal mistake? Huh? Did you think you could still stay on as the president's secretary after this? Stephen's tone was sharp and cutting. I swear, I put it in my bag. Enough already. It wasn't in there, was it? If it were, you wouldn't be in this mess right now. Emily flinched at his harsh tone. Was she used to being reprimanded like this all the time? You're finished. Acting all high and mighty just because you're the president's secretary, and as a newbie, no less. Aren't you embarrassed, carrying around a childish bag like that as an adult? Emily was startled, then reached for a small pouch scattered on the back seat. The contents of her bag were still strewn around from when she'd been searching for the document. She gripped it tightly, trying to hide it from Mr. Nash and me. It looked well worn, as if she'd had it for years. So, immature tastes lead to immature work, huh? We don't need someone who makes these kinds of mistakes in the executive assistant team. Stephen's mocking laughter echoed through the phone. The cruel remarks made me want to cover my ears. But then it hit me. How did Stephen know what was inside Emily's bag? Judging by Emily's reaction, I wondered if this pouch was something she usually kept hidden away, tucked safely in her bag. It confirmed my suspicion that Stephen was involved in the document's disappearance. I was now certain of it. He must have taken the file when Emily left her desk momentarily for Mr. Nash. A small pouch like this wouldn't have been visible unless someone peeked inside her bag. Emily remained silent, looking down with a face that seemed on the verge of tears. She didn't just look discouraged from having her mistake pointed out, and it was the kind of sadness you see when something precious has been belittled. I couldn't stand the thought of seeing her look so defeated any longer. If I wanted to stop Stephen's tirade, there was only one way. Forget the document. I'll accompany you to the meeting and handle the English. Just moments before, I wouldn't have believed I'd say something like that. Emily looked up, startled, while Mr. Nash pumped his fist in a triumphant yes. Thank you, Sean. Here's the Japanese version of the document. As Mr. Nash handed me the file, I gave him a hesitant look and quickly skimmed through it. But there was no time. With only minutes left, I'd have to translate it on the spot during the meeting. I told you I'm rusty, and now I have to translate something this complicated. I let out my frustration, but Mr. Nash didn't seem fazed in the slightest. Then Emily suddenly exclaimed, "Oh!" I was so startled that I accidentally hung up the call. I couldn't help but wonder what Stephen's face must have looked like when he realized the call had ended without warning. He had no idea who'd spoken up in my place. I felt a pang of doubt. Could I really pull this off for Emily's sake? The only real experience I had was from my student days, and it had been years since I'd used English regularly, even though I had some work experience with it back then. But I couldn't just leave Emily to deal with Stephen's petty schemes alone. It reminded me too much of myself back then. I, too, had once believed that I had to handle everything on my own, without relying on anyone. In the end, I'd failed. I didn't want Emily to make the same mistake. As I was desperately recalling all the English I could muster while staring at the documents, Mr. Nash cut through my thoughts. It's time, Sean. He stepped out of the car confidently and strode into Goodness headquarters. He greeted the receptionist with an easy familiarity, making small talk as he led the way. Watching him walk ahead, I felt a strange sense of nostalgia. His back seemed to say, "I don't doubt for a second that you'll do this." Ever since I'd known him, Mr. Nash had always placed his trust in others so easily. And somehow, that trust made me feel like I could do it, too. I'd always thought he was suited to be a leader, even back in the day. And here he was, actually becoming a president. How many years has it been since then? Tyler Nash and I first met back in high school, before he became president. We were attending a well-known college preparatory school in the area, and we became friends after being seated near each other in class. Tyler was tall and lean, with a laid-back attitude and an easy charm that made him popular with the girls. Meanwhile, I was a smart student but not particularly social at the time, so people often asked him, "Why are you friends with Sean?" Each time, he'd reply, "Sean's amazing," or "Sean has a unique perspective," and always spoke well of me. At first, I thought he was just teasing, but he genuinely seemed to believe it. He'd even listened earnestly to my then ridiculous dreams without a hint of judgment. There was a famous economist who was well known for America's New Deal, John Maynard Keynes. Reading his works had sparked my interest in economics, and I started dreaming of studying at Cambridge, where Keynes himself had gone. I've always liked studying, and my grades were good. However, deciding to seriously apply to Cambridge University was a whole different story. There were excellent schools in Japan to study economics, so some might think it wasn't necessary to go all the way to England. And even if I made it into Cambridge after all that effort, I didn't have any clear plans for what I'd do afterward. My only motivation was wanting to study in the same environment as Keynes. I had spent a year in a British boarding school during middle school, so I had no trouble with everyday English. But competing with the world's best students? That would require real resolve. With nothing but this trendy motivation, I didn't think I'd get very far. When I told Tyler about it, though, his eyes lit up as he said, "That's awesome." Annoyed, I snapped, "Don't just say that offhand," but he repeated himself. "You should go for it. Easy for you to say. You can do it." He looked at me with an unwavering gaze. Even as the top student in my class, I knew Cambridge wasn't going to be easy. It's the kind of highly competitive university where, even if I threw everything aside to focus on studying, I'd still have a higher chance of failing. By the way, what was your ranking on the last test? I think I was about 30th from the bottom. Tyler was one of those naturally quick thinkers who could do well if he studied, but I'd never seen him put in real effort. He liked to coast along, as he put it, staying comfortably at the lower ranks. If you told me you wanted to aim for the Tokyo University because of your hero Kurt Thompson, I'd probably stop you. Who's Kurt Thompson? That's not the point. He laughed, then gave me a serious look again. I'd support you, though. His direct gaze startled me, and I found myself looking away. Are you crazy, aiming for Cambridge? Why would you go abroad? What are you trying to prove? Not only did he not mock my ambitions like that, but he even said, "I'll support you." I was so moved by his words that I felt embarrassed and couldn't look up. Hey, are you blushing? Shut up. I stood up abruptly and dashed out of the classroom. My heart was pounding, and I felt like I could do anything. Maybe it sounds foolish, but Tyler's encouragement gave me the motivation to start preparing for Cambridge. With me studying hard by his side, he suddenly decided, "All right, I'll aim for Tokyo University then," and to my amazement, he got in. I remember feeling a bit intimidated by his potential. I also managed to pass the Cambridge entrance exam, and since no one from our school had ever been admitted, the entire school was in an uproar. It's often said that graduating from a university overseas is harder than getting accepted, and that certainly felt true. I thought I had studied the hardest during entrance exam preparation, but once I entered university, the challenges were far greater. But that's Cambridge University, known as one of the highest-ranking institutions internationally. Students come from all over the world, bringing diverse perspectives and ideas. In addition to regular lectures, Cambridge offers supervision, small group sessions of 1 to 3 students. These sessions focus on deeply exploring specialized topics, and preparing for them was no easy task. Just keeping up with the daily classes was a struggle, and letting my guard down even a little meant I'd fall behind. I spent countless days buried in the historic library, absorbed in books, a tough but incredibly stimulating experience. I attended the same university as Keynes and studied economics. At first, that alone was enough for me, but as I talked about future dreams with others studying economics, I began to get a clearer picture of what I wanted to do. While some aimed to work in consulting or start businesses abroad, I felt a strong desire to apply what I learned here back in Japan. I thought that working as a government official in a central ministry might be a way to contribute to Japanese society. With that goal, I graduated from Cambridge University, aiming for a career in the civil service. But from this point on, my life took an unexpected turn. For the first few years after joining the ministry, I was so busy that I barely have any memory of that time. In the bureaucracy, there's a career rotation system where you're transferred every 2 to 3 years. I transferred about 3 times, and although the workload was relentless, I managed to avoid conflicts within each department. However, unlike my student days, when effort could overcome most challenges, I soon realized that relationships between people aren't something that can be solved through hard work alone. In my new department, I began struggling with my interactions with a senior official. Even in the ministry, the hierarchy between bosses and subordinates, as well as seniors and juniors, is much like that of a typical company. Each department had many capable senior officials, but there was one person I just couldn't get along with. While I could take constructive criticism, this person frequently interfered with my personal life. He mocked my personality and mannerisms as if they were something to laugh at. At first, I tried to go along without causing trouble, but the continuous pressure of long hours and unrelenting work began to wear me down mentally and physically. His words were like small, constant pricks to my heart. If it had been only once, I could have brushed it off, but the accumulation over time became painful. As I endured, the wounds grew deeper, and the pain became unbearable. Working in the central ministry, being at the heart of the government, was as busy as one would expect. During parliamentary sessions, every ministry is overwhelmed. My department was no exception, and late nights became the norm. One day, I collapsed during work. My mind and body had reached their limit. And that was the end of my career. It was my 10th year in the ministry. After 10 years of relentless work and mental anguish, I had finally reached a point where I couldn't continue. In hindsight, it was my first experience of failure in life. Fortunately, after a short rest, my physical health improved significantly, but healing my mind was a much harder task. Studying had always been manageable, and I had friends who understood me. I used to think I could push through anything if I tried hard enough, but this experience made me realize there are limits. As I sat in the hospital, gazing out the window, wondering what to do next after quitting my job, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my friend Tyler. We had stayed in touch over the years, reaching out about once a year since high school. Recently, we'd both been too busy to meet, but reading his familiar, quirky writing from high school warmed my heart. "I'm in the hospital now. Collapsed. Watch yourself." When I replied honestly about my situation, Tyler, usually so nonchalant, rushed over to the hospital, visibly concerned. Upon seeing me, he looked relieved and said, "Hey, you look fine." As we enjoyed the reunion, I shared the story of my resignation and the heavy thoughts I was carrying. Tyler listened intently. "I've always liked having a goal to work toward, but now, I have nothing." It felt as if there was a hole in my heart, draining away all my motivation and energy. I had never experienced anything like it before. "Then maybe you don't need to do anything right now." Tyler said this in his usual laid-back way. That might be true, but I can't just keep doing nothing forever. I sighed, and Tyler suddenly looked as if he'd had an idea. "So, how about being a driver?" "I just happened to be looking for one." "A driver? Like for a taxi?" "No, my own personal driver." I realized I hadn't asked him about his recent life, and it turned out Tyler had become a president. He always seemed suited for leadership, But to think that the same guy who was near the bottom in high school tests had become the head of a company with many employees was surprising, to say the least. And so, I became Mr. Nash's driver. When we entered the conference room, the employees from Goodness were already gathered. Mr. Nash greeted the person who seemed to be the head of their international division in English. I thought to myself, so, he can speak English after all, as I introduced myself and the meeting began. Since I'd only had a brief moment to glance over the documents, I translated on the fly, pushing my mind to its limits. There were some rough spots, but my English seemed to get the message across, and the negotiation progressed smoothly, ending with a contract. We secured a $10 million deal. Emily watched the entire exchange, mouth agape, listening to my English. Sean. That was amazing. When we returned to the car, Emily, still excited, spoke to me as I settled into the driver's seat. Oh, thanks. I'm just glad it worked out. Phew, that was a relief. As I translated my hardest in the meeting, Mr. Nash had just sat back, seemingly calm, which had me wondering if he'd ever felt nervous at all. The confidence was almost irritating. He trusts me a bit too much. I'm heading back to the office, but next time, it's your turn. When I hinted about Emily and Stephen, Mr. Nash nodded and said, I know. Handling things like this is part of my job. I was planning to handle things with Stephen on my own. It's my responsibility that things escalated this way. I'm very sorry. Emily bowed deeply toward Mr. Nash and me. Emily. I know Sean advised me not to carry this all alone. Watching Emily, I saw a bit of my past self. If you keep holding it in, there's only so much you can bear before hitting your limit. You have to act before it comes to that. I hadn't been able to lean on anyone, but I didn't want Emily to end up like me. Don't worry. Thanks to Sean, it didn't turn into the worst-case scenario, right? Tyler said proudly as if it were his achievement. Well, you did help me pick my college back then. Mr. Nash didn't miss the words I muttered under my breath. Huh? Thanks to me? Did I do something? Shut up. It's nothing. Too embarrassed to explain further, I turned back to the driver's seat. Come on, tell me. Emily, unable to contain herself, burst into laughter at Mr. Nash's clueless tone. Her bright laughter filled the car. When Mr. Nash summoned Stephen, he hadn't realized that his exchanges with Emily had reached Mr. Nash's ears, and he practically fell to the ground in shock. I'm so sorry. Stephen bowed so low his head almost hit the floor. Even though it didn't go all the way, as a company, we couldn't ignore the potential damage Stephen had attempted to cause. Instead of apologizing to me, there's someone else you need to apologize to first. When Stephen timidly lifted his head, he found Emily standing right in front of him. Mr. Nash, I've already. Having to admit defeat to someone he's looked down on for being a newcomer and lacking experience. It's hard to imagine a greater humiliation for Stephen. I'm sorry. Just as he stammered out the words, his shoulders shaking, Mr. Nash spoke firmly, I can't hear you. I am very sorry. Seeing the usually calm Mr. Nash raise his voice, Stephen seemed too stunned to even be confused. Emily told me excitedly that she'd never seen Mr. Nash like that before. As for Emily's pouch, the very thing that had led to her catching on to Stephen's schemes, she later explained that to me herself. Surprisingly, Emily was known for forgetting things a lot as a child. Her mother had given her that well-worn pouch as a charm, saying, "Keep this with you to help you remember." Ever since then, Emily somehow stopped forgetting things. Now, even though it's mostly for luck, she feels a bit uneasy without it. It's so worn out now that I wouldn't want anyone to see it. It's just a charm, Emily said, holding it tightly with a hint of embarrassment yet with clear affection. As for Stephen, he was transferred to a different department after years of dominating the secretary division. His new role had nothing in common with the secretarial duties, so he's struggling, not knowing where to start. Now he's being taught by younger employees and even talked about behind his back as useless. The other day, I spotted him eating lunch alone in the cafeteria, looking rather forlorn. My days felt like a long vacation. Though outwardly, I was Mr. Nash's driver, all I'd been doing was giving a friend a lift. It's not that I thought driving was easy, but stepping into a completely different line of work gave me a fresh perspective and sparked a desire to take on something new. I'll need to find a new driver, Mr. Nash said as I opened the back door. Today was my last day giving him a lift. You'll find someone in no time. So, have you decided what you're doing next? Yeah. An old friend from my time in England reached out recently. Strangely enough, a friend from college contacted me after years. He offered me a chance to work together on a project. A year ago, I probably would have turned it down without a second thought. But I'm sure that successfully closing that high-stakes deal the other day played a role in shifting my mindset. Being in that intense atmosphere felt like it unlocked something within me. So, you're going back to England? Yeah, I think it'll be good to visit after all this time. It's a startup, so it looks promising. I can look forward now. It's thanks to Mr. Nash, who reached out when I was at my lowest. I don't quite know how to thank him, and it's a bit embarrassing to say too much. You're excited, aren't you? Well, yeah. When you're like this, things usually turn out fine. Mr. Nash said that and laughed. What's that supposed to mean? You've got this. It was exactly what I needed to hear. The words that would keep me going more than any others. With those words, I felt like I could face any challenges that lay ahead. Thanks. As I turned around and spoke softly, Mr. Nash didn't miss a word. What was that? Annoyed by his teasing grin, I gave him a hard pat on the back to cover my embarrassment. Well, I'm short-staffed over there. Mind if I recruit Emily? Absolutely not. Today marked the end of our relationship as driver and boss. But our bond would remain unchanged from here on. Imagining the bright futures that awaited us, we set out on our own paths.